The defensive line on the eastern ridge collapsed at 14 minutes past dawn, and I watched 300 Thyralian soldiers die in the time it takes to draw a breath. I am Commander Valith San of the Outer Rim Coalition Garrison, on Dreth Val, and by the time this account reaches whoever reads it, the galaxy will have changed forever. But in that moment, standing in a shattered command bunker with dust raining from fractured ceiling plates and alarms screaming from every console, all I knew was that we were losing. Again. Still, the way we had been losing for 2 years across 100 worlds, watching the Vraxian swarm consume everything the Coalition had built and defended and bled for. The tactical display flickered, stabilized, and showed me the shape of our destruction in clean blue lines. The swarm's 6th wave was rolling across the plains east of Colony proper, a tide of chitin and bioacid and mindless hunger that stretched from the Grey Vault Mountains to the river delta. Tens of thousands of bioforms, more than we had faced in any single assault since the siege began. My garrison was down to 40% combat strength. My ammunition reserves were calculated in hours rather than days, and the reinforcement fleet was 6 days out. 6 days. We would not last 6 hours. "Commander," my signals officer called from across the bunker, her voice tight with something I had never heard from Lieutenant Soreth before. Fear. Actual fear, from a soldier who had held her post through 4 previous Vraxian assaults without flinching. "Coalition High Command has transmitted an authorization code. Contingency Kale." The bunker went quiet. Every officer, every technician, every runner and aide stopped what they were doing. I felt the silence land on my scales like a physical weight. Contingency Kale. I had read about it in classified briefings. I had discussed it in hypothetical terms with other commanders over secured channels. I had never, in my 23 years of service, expected to hear those words spoken aloud in an active combat zone. "Confirm the authorization," I said. Soreth confirmed it. 3 times, through 3 independent channels. The code was genuine. Contingency Kale was the formal request for human military intervention. I stood there in my ruined bunker, listening to the distant concussion of Vraxian siege organisms hammering our outer wall, and I felt something I could not name. Not hope. I was too experienced for hope. Not fear either, though perhaps I should have felt it. What I felt was closer to vertigo. The sense of standing at the edge of a cliff I had spent my entire career pretending did not exist. Every species in the Coalition had stories about humans. Every barracks on every world, every officer's mess, every training academy had its collection of human legends, passed around like contraband, half believed and half dismissed. The Pelori border incident, where a single human battalion met a Pelori armored division, and the Pelori never fielded that division again. The Drothi Station siege, where a mercenary company of humans held a refueling platform against an entire raiding fleet for 11 days and walked out intact when the fleet withdrew. The pacification of Voss 7, where a human platoon did in 9 days what 3 coalition brigades had failed to accomplish in a year. Stories. Legends, the kind of tales that species tell about other species when they need to believe that someone, somewhere, is strong enough to save them. I did not believe in legends. I was a field officer. I believed in ammunition counts and defensive geometry and the cold arithmetic of attrition warfare. I believed in what I could see and measure and deploy. The idea that one species could be qualitatively different from every other combat-capable civilization in the galaxy struck me as not just unlikely, but intellectually offensive. We were all products of evolution, all shaped by our worlds, all bound by the same physics. The notion that humans were somehow exempt from these constraints smelled like mythology dressed in military uniform. And privately, in the quiet spaces of my mind, where I kept the thoughts I did not share with subordinates, I suspected that the human legends were exactly what defeated species always produce. Excuses. The Pelori did not lose because they were outfought. They lost because of humans. The Drothi did not fail because their tactics were flawed. They failed because of humans. It was a convenient story. It absolved everyone of accountability, except the species that was never in the room to defend itself. But I had no ammunition, no reinforcements, and no options. "Transmit the request," I said. Soreth transmitted. The signal went out through coalition relay stations, bounced across 3 star systems, and disappeared into the void. I returned to the grim business of watching my garrison die by degrees. The next 8 hours were a grinding, methodical horror. The Vraxian sixth wave did not break through our remaining lines, but it chewed away at them with the patient, mechanical hunger that made the swarm the most terrifying enemy the coalition had ever faced. The Vraxians did not tire. They did not hesitate. They did not mourn their dead. They simply advanced, absorbed our fire, and advanced again. For every bioform we killed, 2 more crawled over its remains. I lost the southern watchtower at noon. The crew held their position until Vraxian acid spitters dissolved the structural supports, and the entire tower folded inward like a collapsing throat. I lost Firebase Ketan at mid-afternoon, when a burrowing organism tunneled beneath the foundation and erupted inside the perimeter, scattering my soldiers before they could form a defensive ring. I lost good people, soldiers I had trained, officers I had trusted, friends whose names I still carry in the quiet parts of my memory where rank and duty cannot reach. By evening, I had pulled everything back to the inner perimeter. The colony's civilian population was sheltered in the underground transit network. My remaining combat units were spread across a defensive line that was too long for their numbers and too thin for the enemy's strength. We were a wall made of willpower and nothing else, and I could feel the cracks spreading. Then Soreth looked up from her console with an expression I could not read. "Commander, I am receiving a narrow-band transmission on a frequency we do not use. It is not in any coalition communication protocol." She paused. "The signal identifies itself as human." I crossed the bunker in 4 strides. "Put it through." Static. Then a voice, clear and calm and speaking accented coalition standard, with the flat precision of someone who had learned the language from a textbook rather than a conversation. "Coalition Garrison Dreth Val, this is Captain Dara Rennick, Terran Rapid Response Element 7. We are in system and inbound to your position. Estimated arrival, 11 standard hours. Request landing coordinates and a tactical briefing on current enemy disposition. Rennick out." That was it. No pleasantries, no reassurances, no dramatic promises or heroic declarations. Just a name, a unit designation, and a request for data. The transmission lasted 9 seconds. I replayed it twice. Not because I needed to hear the words again, but because I needed to hear the voice. There was something in it. Not confidence exactly, though it was confident. Not arrogance, though it carried the unmistakable weight of someone who expected to be taken seriously. What I heard in Captain Dara Rennick's voice was the sound of a person for whom the situation I was drowning in was simply a problem to be solved. Routine, manageable, almost boring. That was the moment the vertigo returned, because either this human captain was delusional or she knew something about war that I did not. I transmitted our coordinates, our force disposition, our casualty figures, our ammunition status, and every scrap of intelligence we had gathered on the Vraxian force structure. Then, I ordered Soreth to monitor every sensor we had pointed skyward, and tell me the instant she detected an inbound vessel. 10 hours and 40 minutes later, Soreth said, "Commander, I have nothing on sensors, no inbound contacts on any frequency." 18 minutes after that, a dropship landed inside our perimeter. It came down in the secondary vehicle yard, 200 meters from my command bunker. No engine flare. No approach trajectory on any of our tracking systems. No transponder signal. No identification broadcast. No request for landing clearance. One moment the yard was empty. The next, a matte black craft was sitting on the permacrete, as if it had always been there, its hull absorbing light, so completely that it looked less like a ship and more like a hole cut in the world. I stared at my sensor displays. Nothing. The ship was physically present, visible through the bunker's external cameras, and my entire detection grid reported empty sky. Every tracking system, every motion sensor, every thermal scanner showed nothing at all. I had spent my career trusting instruments over instincts. In that moment, for the first time, I understood that my instruments had just been rendered obsolete by a species I had dismissed as mythological. I sealed my sidearm, straightened my uniform, and walked out to meet the humans. The night air hit me first, thick with the chemical stink of Vraxian bioresidue and the sharper smell of our own burnt-out plasma batteries. The colony perimeter was lit by emergency floods, casting everything in harsh white light and deep shadow. My boots crunched on debris. Somewhere to the east, a Vraxian patrol probed our line and was driven back by automatic fire. The war went on. It always went on. The dropship's ramp was already down. Figures moved in the interior, shadows against dim red light. Then they emerged, and I saw humans in the flesh for the first time. My first thought was that they were smaller than I expected. My second thought, which followed the first by approximately half a heartbeat, was that something about the way they moved made size irrelevant. There were perhaps 140 of them, filing down the ramp in a double column with the silent, fluid efficiency of water finding its path through stone. They carried rifles and sidearms. They wore armor that looked light by coalition standards, fitted close to their bodies rather than bulked outward for maximum protection. No powered exoskeletons, no visible augmentation, no energy shields. By every metric I used to assess combat readiness, they were under-equipped for a Vraxian engagement. But the way they moved, I had commanded soldiers from 6 different coalition species. I knew what trained infantry looked like. I knew the way experienced fighters carried themselves, the way combat veterans occupied space differently from fresh recruits. These humans moved like nothing I had ever seen. Every step was deliberate. Every turn of the head covered a specific arc. Every hand position was a decision, not an accident. They were not walking down a ramp. They were conducting a tactical assessment of their environment in real time, and they were doing it so naturally that it looked like breathing. At the base of the ramp, a woman separated from the column and walked toward me. She was compact, shorter than most of her soldiers, with close-cropped dark hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from something hard and left out in bad weather. She moved with a loose, unhurried stride that somehow covered ground faster than it should have. "Commander San," she said. Not a question. She already knew my name, my rank, my face. "Captain Dara Rennick. Terran Rapid Response. Thank you for the tactical package. My analysts have been working it since we received your transmission." She glanced at the eastern horizon, where the faint bioluminescent glow of the Vraxian swarm painted the sky in sick yellow-green. "You have approximately 14 hours before their next major push. That gives us enough time." "Enough time for what?" I asked. Rennick looked at me with eyes that reflected the emergency floods like chips of gray metal. "To show you what we do." She turned and began issuing orders to her soldiers, and I stood in the chemical-stinking darkness of a besieged colony world, watching a species I had called mythological unload their gear, with the quiet competence of people who had done this 1,000 times before, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet in a way that had nothing to do with Vraxian burrowers. 11 hours. They said they would come in 11 hours. They came in less, without a single sensor detecting their approach, in a ship that should not have existed by any technology I understood. And they looked at the war that was killing us and called it manageable. I walked back to my bunker with the vertigo singing in my bones, and for the first time in 2 years, I was not sure whether I was afraid of the enemy in front of me or the allies behind me. I did not sleep that night. I told myself it was because of the tactical situation, and that was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I spent the hours between their arrival and dawn watching the humans through every camera and sensor feed I could access, and everything I saw made the legends harder to dismiss and the universe harder to understand. They set up in the eastern sector without asking permission. I should have been angry about that. Protocol required Allied forces to coordinate positioning through my command staff, to submit defensive plans for approval, to integrate into our existing tactical framework. The humans did none of this. They walked into my eastern sector as if they owned it, and they began making changes. I watched a team of 4 humans reposition a plasma battery emplacement that my engineers had spent 2 days installing. They moved it 11 meters to the north and rotated it 15 degrees. I pulled up the firing solution for the new position and compared it to the old one. The new position covered a dead zone that my engineers had missed, eliminated a blind spot created by a collapsed residential building, and provided a fallback corridor that connected to 2 other defensive positions my team had not thought to link. It was a better position. Objectively, measurably better. And they had identified the improvement in minutes, in the dark, on a battlefield they had never seen before. This happened across the entire eastern sector. Every position they touched became sharper, tighter, more lethal. They did not consult with my officers. They did not study our defensive plans. They simply looked at the terrain, looked at the enemy's likely approach vectors, and rearranged the geometry of the kill zone with the casual precision of someone straightening furniture in their own home. I watched them work, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear, recognition. The slow, terrible recognition that these people understood warfare at a level my species had never reached. That the gap between us was not one of technology or numbers or resources, but of something fundamental. Something in the way their minds processed violence and space and probability. They were better than us. Not by a little. By a margin I did not yet have the vocabulary to describe. At some point in the early hours, a Vraxian probe force hit the eastern perimeter. 20 bioforms, maybe 25. A standard probing attack meant to test our response times and identify weak points. My soldiers would have handled it in 4 minutes with 2 or 3 casualties. The humans handled it in 40 seconds with no casualties. I watched the feed 3 times. The humans did not scramble. They did not shout orders or rush to positions. They shifted, all of them, simultaneously, like a single organism redirecting its attention. Rifles came up. Fire poured into the Vraxian probe with a density and accuracy that left no room for survival. Every round found a neural cluster. Every burst was exactly long enough to kill, and not a fraction of a second longer. The probe force was dead before the last bioform in the group had fully cleared the rubble line. 40 seconds. And then they went back to repositioning the plasma battery as if nothing had happened. I closed the feed. I sat in the dark, and I thought about all the officers like me, on all the worlds like this one, who had dismissed the legends as fantasy. We were wrong. I understood that now, in my gut if not yet in my mind. But understanding it and knowing what it meant were 2 different things. And the second would not come until dawn, when the real battle began, and I saw what humans looked like when they stopped being careful. Captain Rennick appeared at my command bunker at first light, moving through the damaged corridors with the easy stride of someone visiting a colleague's office, rather than entering a besieged military installation. She carried a portable display unit and a metal canister that turned out to contain a hot black liquid the humans called coffee. She offered me a cup. I declined. She shrugged and drank it herself, and the casual normality of the gesture against the backdrop of impending annihilation struck me as either insane or the most profound expression of composure I had ever witnessed. "I want to brief you on our tactical approach," she said, unfolding the display on my command table. "You have the right to know what we are going to do on your battlefield." I appreciated the courtesy, even as I noted that she said your battlefield rather than our battlefield. She was drawing a distinction. This was my ground, my garrison, my responsibility. She was a guest with guns. The briefing lasted 20 minutes. In that time, Captain Dara Rennick dismantled every assumption I held about infantry combat and rebuilt it from the foundation up. She called it adaptive pressure doctrine. The principle was deceptively simple. Instead of establishing a defensive position and holding it against enemy assault, which was the basis of every coalition tactical manual ever written, the humans operated on a philosophy of constant tactical mutation. They changed their approach every few minutes. Ranged fire to close quarters, dispersed formation to concentrated, static defense to aggressive counterattack. Each shift was designed to force the enemy to recalculate, and each recalculation cost the enemy time and momentum. "The Vraxian hive mind is fast," Rennick said, tracing swarm movement patterns on the display. "It processes information and adapts within seconds. But it has a weakness. Every adaptation requires the hive to commit resources to a new tactical model. If we force adaptations faster than the hive can consolidate, we create a cognitive lag. The swarm becomes reactive instead of proactive, and a reactive enemy is a dying enemy." I stared at the display. "You are describing a strategy that treats the entire swarm as a single opponent with a single mind." That is exactly what it is. No coalition force has ever fought the Vraxians that way. We engage the bioforms, the individual units. Rennick looked at me with an expression I would later learn to recognize as patience worn thin by repetition. "That is why you are losing." The words landed like a slap. I felt my scales flush with heat and my upper hands clench. She was right, and the fact that she was right made it worse. We had been fighting the Vraxian body for 2 years. The humans intended to fight the Vraxian brain. Then she told me something that shattered the last remnant of my comfortable skepticism. "My company has engaged the Vraxian swarm before," she said. "Kellis Point, 14 months ago." I knew Kellis Point. Every coalition officer knew Kellis Point. It was listed in our records as a catastrophic loss. The colony overrun, the garrison destroyed, the civilian population consumed. It was one of the swarm's most complete victories. "Kellis Point was a total loss," I said. "The colony was lost," Rennick agreed. "The garrison was coalition. And yes, they were destroyed before we arrived. But my company was operating independently in the sector. We inserted after the garrison fell. We spent 9 days inside occupied territory, and on the 9th day, we located and destroyed a Vraxian queen node." I stopped breathing. A queen node was the central processing organism for an entire regional swarm. Destroying one would cripple Vraxian operations across an entire star system. No coalition force had ever located a queen node, let alone destroyed one. They were buried deep behind enemy lines, protected by layers of defensive bioforms, hidden by the swarm's own biological sensor jamming capabilities. "That is not in any coalition record," I said. "No, it would not be. We were not part of the coalition at the time. We reported our action through Terran channels. Your intelligence services either did not receive the report or chose not to distribute it." She paused. "I suspect the latter. A report confirming that humans accomplished what no coalition force has ever managed would have been politically inconvenient." I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You destroyed a queen node," I said, "with a single company." With a single company. 38 casualties, 12 fatal. We extracted with full operational capability and returned to Terran space. She folded the display and tucked it under her arm. "Commander San, I am not telling you this to impress you. I am telling you because you need to understand what my soldiers can do if you are going to trust us on your line. The legends you have heard about humans are not exaggerations. Some of them are understatements. And what we did at Kellis Point, we can do here. But I need you to let us fight the way we fight. Not the way your manual says allies should fight." She left the bunker. I sat alone with the ghosts of every assumption I had ever held about the limits of infantry combat, and I listened to them die one by one. That evening, I walked the perimeter. The air was cooling, the sky turning the deep purple of Dreth Val's long twilight. The Vraxian glow on the eastern horizon had intensified. Tomorrow would bring the full assault. I could feel it the way old soldiers feel weather, a pressure in the atmosphere that meant something massive was building. I found a human soldier sitting alone on a broken wall near the eastern gun line. She was cleaning a blade. Not a plasma cutter or a vibration knife, but an actual metal blade, the kind of weapon that belonged in a museum rather than a modern battlefield. Her rifle sat beside her, gleaming with maintenance, but it was the knife that held her attention. "That is an unusual sidearm," I said. She looked up, young by human standards, pale eyes and a face smudged with grime, and something that might have been dried Vraxian fluid. She held up the knife so the emergency lights caught its edge. "Standard issue, Commander. Every one of us carries one. You have plasma weapons, projectile weapons, grenades. Why carry a blade?" She turned the knife slowly, watching light slide along the steel. "Everything runs out of power eventually." She said it simply, without drama, as if she were stating an obvious fact about the universe, and I suppose she was. Everything runs out of power eventually. Batteries die, generators fail, ammunition is spent, but a blade is just metal and will is the one resource that humans seem to possess in quantities that defied rational measurement. I walked away from that broken wall with the weight of a new understanding settling onto my shoulders, and I did not sleep that night either. Not because of fear, because the universe I had lived in for 47 years, the universe where all species were fundamentally equal and legends were just stories, had finished dying, and I was not yet ready to meet the one that was replacing it. Dawn came to Drethval the color of bruised fruit, and with it came the end of everything I thought I knew about war. The sensors lit up at first light. Every screen, every display, every instrument in my command bunker screamed the same message in the universal language of cascading red indicators. The Vraxian swarm was moving. Not a probe, not a testing action. The full regional swarm, every bioform the hive mind had committed to the Drethval campaign, was rolling toward our perimeter in a wave that stretched from horizon to horizon. I had seen swarm assaults before. I had survived 4 of them on this world alone, but I had never seen anything like this. The tactical display rendered the approaching force as a solid red mass, so dense that individual bioform signatures merged into a single continuous block of hostile contacts. My targeting computer attempted to generate a count and failed. It was not designed to process numbers that large. Estimated force strength, I said, and my voice sounded strange in my own ears. Flat, mechanical, the voice of a commander who has already done the math and knows the answer. Lieutenant Soreth worked her console. Sensor resolution is degrading due to signal density. Minimum estimate based on available data is 42,000 bioforms, supported by heavy siege organisms and aerial spore carriers. She paused. Commander, this exceeds any previous Vraxian deployment against this garrison by a factor of 3. 42,000, against my garrison of fewer than 2,000 combat-effective soldiers and 140 humans. I activated the garrison-wide communication channel. All units, this is Commander Sanan. The swarm is committing its full regional strength against our position. All defensive sectors will engage on my order. Hold your lines, hold your people. We hold this ground today. I closed the channel before anyone could hear the doubt in my voice. The first wave hit the outer perimeter 19 minutes later. They came across the shattered plains in a rolling tide of chitin and bioacid, thousands of warrior-class bioforms running at full speed, their limbs churning the broken earth into clouds of gray dust. Behind them, the larger siege organisms lumbered forward, their armored carapaces deflecting the opening salvos from our long-range plasma batteries. Above them, spore carriers drifted on membranous wings, releasing clouds of caustic biological agents that ate through metal and flesh with equal efficiency. My soldiers opened fire. The perimeter erupted in light and sound, a continuous barrage of plasma bolts and projectile rounds that turned the first 100 meters of no man's land into a killing field. Vraxian bioforms fell by the dozens, by the hundreds. Their bodies piled against our barriers, and the ones behind them climbed over the dead without slowing. The mathematics of the swarm were simple and merciless. We killed them faster than any garrison in coalition history had ever killed them. And it did not matter, because there were always more. For every bioform that fell, 2 more surged forward through the gap. Our firing solutions overlapped, and still left corridors of approach that the swarm exploited with the mindless efficiency of water finding cracks in a dam. The first breach came 12 minutes into the engagement. A section of the northern wall, weakened by 3 days of acid spitter bombardment, collapsed under the weight of a siege organism that had absorbed enough plasma fire to melt a cruiser's hull and kept walking. Vraxian bioforms poured through the gap, and I lost contact with the 2 squads defending that section in the space of a single heartbeat. I rerouted reserves to seal the breach. It cost me soldiers I could not replace. The second breach came 8 minutes later, on the southern approach. A burrowing organism surfaced inside the perimeter, disgorging a cluster of fast-attack bioforms directly behind our defensive line. My soldiers fought them in close quarters, in the narrow spaces between buildings where plasma weapons were as dangerous to the user as to the target. I watched the engagement through a security camera and saw a Thyralian corporal take down a warrior-class bioform with nothing but a broken rifle stock and raw desperation. She died 30 seconds later, when a second bioform found her from behind. I was losing. The math was clear. Every minute cost me soldiers I could not spare, ground I could not recover, time I did not have. The swarm did not need to be clever. It just needed to be relentless, and relentlessness was the one quality it possessed in infinite supply. Then Captain Rennick's voice came through my command channel, calm and precise, and carrying not a trace of the panic that was clawing at the edges of my own composure. "Commander San, this is Rennick. The eastern perimeter has been breached. Vraxian bioforms are through the line in strength. My company is moving to engage. I recommend you pull your eastern units back to secondary positions and give us room to work." The eastern perimeter. The section I had identified as the most vulnerable point in our entire defense. The one I had reinforced 3 times and still could not hold. And Rennick was telling me to pull my soldiers out of it. "Captain, if I withdraw from the eastern line, there will be nothing between the swarm and colony proper, except your company." "That is correct, Commander. Give us room to work." I wanted to argue. Every instinct forged by 23 years of defensive warfare screamed at me to hold every position, contest every meter, make the enemy pay for every step. But I remembered the probe attack. 40 seconds, no casualties. I remembered Kellis Point, a queen node destroyed by a single company. I remembered the knife and the woman who carried it, and the flat certainty in her voice when she said, "Everything runs out of power eventually." I gave the order. My eastern units pulled back, and the humans went forward. I watched it through the tactical feed, and what I saw in the next 6 hours rewrote the fundamental architecture of my understanding of what living beings are capable of when violence is not just a tool, but a language they speak with native fluency. The humans advanced into the breach, not to hold the line, not to plug the gap and wait for the enemy to exhaust itself against their position. They moved forward, into the mass of Vraxian bioforms that had broken through our perimeter, and they attacked. 140 soldiers walked into a swarm of thousands and began killing with a precision and coordination that I lack the vocabulary to properly describe. They operated in teams of 4, each team moving as a single entity, covering angles, rotating positions, providing overlapping fields of fire that left no approach uncontested. Their rifles cracked in sharp, controlled bursts, and every burst found a neural cluster, the fist-sized knot of dense tissue at the base of a Vraxian bioform's skull that was the only reliable kill point on the organism. Coalition soldiers aimed for center mass. We poured fire into the largest target area and relied on volume to compensate for accuracy. The humans did not miss. They did not aim for center mass. They aimed for neural clusters, targets the size of a closed fist on creatures moving at full combat speed through broken terrain in poor light, and they hit them. Every time. A fire team of 4 humans moved through a cluster of 9 warrior-class bioforms in 11 seconds. 11 seconds. 9 targets, 9 neural cluster hits, 9 kills. Then they pivoted, shifted formation, and engaged the next group without breaking stride. I watched a human squad leader stand in the open, fully exposed to a charging line of bioforms, and place 3 rounds into 3 neural clusters in the time it took the lead bioform to cover 10 meters. Then she sidestepped, let the dead creature's momentum carry it past her, and put a 4th round into a bioform that had flanked her position from the left. She had not turned to look. She had tracked it by sound alone. They were not fighting the way soldiers fight. They were not grinding, not enduring, not surviving by margin and luck and stubbornness. They were executing. Each engagement was a solved problem. Each movement a calculated answer to a tactical equation that they processed, and resolved, and moved past, before my own officers had finished identifying the threat. And they communicated without speaking. I watched the feed for minutes at a time, without hearing a single human voice on the tactical channel. They used hand signals, body positions, glances that carried meaning I could not decode. A slight turn of the head, a shift in grip on a weapon, a half step to the left that somehow told 3 other soldiers exactly where to move and when to fire. They had been fighting together so long, or they were so fundamentally attuned to each other's patterns, that language was unnecessary. They had transcended it. 20 minutes into the engagement, I noticed something on the tactical display that made me grip the edge of my command table until my claws scored the metal. The Vraxian bioforms facing the human advance were behaving differently from those attacking the rest of our perimeter. The bioforms on the northern and southern lines continued their assault with the mindless, relentless aggression that defined the swarm. But the bioforms in the eastern sector, the ones facing the humans, were slowing, bunching, redirecting. The swarm was trying to route around the human positions. I had fought the Vraxians for 2 years. I had studied their behavior patterns across dozens of engagements. The swarm did not avoid contact. It was a hive organism, driven by biological imperatives that did not include self-preservation at the individual level. Vraxian bioforms did not retreat. They did not hesitate. They did not reroute around obstacles. They hit the obstacle until it broke, or they died trying. But these bioforms were hesitating. The hive mind, processing the catastrophic casualty rate in the eastern sector, was doing something it had never done against coalition forces in the entire history of the war. It was flinching. The swarm was afraid of them. A hive intelligence with no individual consciousness, no concept of fear in any way that a biologist would recognize, was experiencing something functionally identical to terror in the face of 140 human soldiers. I sat back from my display. My hands were shaking. My scales had gone pale. The Thyralian physiological response to profound shock. Around me, my staff officers watched the same feeds with expressions I had never seen on their faces before. Not fear, not hope, something older and stranger. The expression of people watching a fundamental law of their universe break apart and reform into a shape they do not recognize. The battle continued. The humans continued. They did not slow down. They did not tire. They did not show any of the signs that every coalition species exhibited under sustained combat. The trembling hands, the widening eyes, the gradual degradation of accuracy and judgment that marked the onset of combat fatigue. 4 hours into the engagement, the humans were fighting with the same lethal precision they had displayed in the first minute. 5 hours, 6. Midway through the 5th hour, I watched a human soldier take a Vraxian bone spine through the left shoulder. The spine was a biological projectile, 15 centimeters of razor-sharp chitin fired from a warrior-class bioform's dorsal launcher at velocities that could penetrate light armor. It hit the human soldier just below the collarbone and punched through the back of her armor in a spray of red. She did not scream. She did not fall. She reached up with her right hand, gripped the protruding spine, and snapped it off at the entry point. Then she shifted her rifle to her right hand, braced it against her hip, and resumed firing. Accurate fire, kill shots, every one of them, placed with the surgical precision of a surgeon operating through a scope. She fought for another 40 minutes before a medic pulled her off the line. 40 minutes with a piece of alien bone lodged in her shoulder, and she never missed a shot. I thought about my soldiers, my brave, disciplined, well-trained Thyralian soldiers who had held this colony against impossible odds for months. If one of them took a wound like that, they would be screaming. They would be in shock. They would be out of the fight, and rightly so, because that was the natural, biological, reasonable response to catastrophic physical trauma. The human response was not natural. It was not reasonable. It was something that evolution had built into them, on a world where showing weakness meant death, where the capacity to absorb damage and continue fighting was not a virtue, but a survival requirement. And they had carried that capacity across the stars and into a war that was not theirs, because someone had finally asked them for help. By early afternoon, the eastern breach was sealed, not just held, sealed. The humans had pushed the Vraxian assault back 300 meters beyond our original perimeter line. They had taken ground. In a defensive engagement against a numerically superior swarm force, 140 human soldiers had counterattacked and gained 300 meters. My garrison had been fighting to hold what we had for months, and the humans had looked at our line and decided it was not far enough forward. The effect on the rest of the garrison was immediate and electric. My soldiers on the northern and southern lines had been watching the human advance through their own tactical feeds between engagements. They had seen the same things I had seen, and something changed in them. I could hear it in the comm chatter, see it in the way they moved, feel it in the tightening of fire discipline, and the steadying of hands that had been shaking an hour ago. The knowledge that someone on their side was winning, not just holding, but actively winning, sent a current through the garrison that no speech or order could have produced. Morale is an invisible thing. You cannot measure it, cannot issue it from a supply depot, cannot manufacture it in a factory. But when it shifts, you feel it the way you feel gravity. And on that afternoon, the gravity of Dreth Val shifted, and my garrison, my battered and bleeding and half-broken garrison, began to fight like soldiers who believed they could win. By evening, the sixth wave was spent. The Vraxian assault faltered, fragmented, and withdrew. Bioforms that had been pressing forward with mindless aggression turned and lumbered back across the plains, leaving a carpet of their own dead, so thick that the ground was invisible beneath them. My soldiers stood on their battered walls and watched the swarm retreat, and some of them cheered, and some of them cried, and some of them simply stood in silence and tried to understand what had happened. I received the casualty report from the human company at sunset. I read it at my command table, alone, in a bunker that smelled like ozone and burnt chitin, and the copper tang of blood from 3 different species. 140 human soldiers had held the eastern breach against approximately 8,000 Vraxian bioforms for 6 hours. Human casualties, 11 wounded. 0 killed. I read the report 3 times. The numbers did not change. I locked my command terminal. I sat in the dark. And I let the old universe, the one where all species were fundamentally equal on the battlefield, where legends were just stories, and humans were just another civilization among thousands, finish dying. It died quietly, without protest. The way things die, when they were never really alive to begin with, just comfortable illusions we held, because the truth was too large and too strange, and too frightening to look at directly. The truth was walking around my garrison right now, cleaning weapons and checking wounds and drinking that bitter black liquid they carried everywhere. And the truth looked like ordinary people doing extraordinary things, as if they could not imagine any other way to exist. The Vraxian swarm pulled back for 48 hours after the failed 6th wave, and in those 48 hours, I learned more about humanity than the entire coalition intelligence apparatus had managed to compile in a century of diplomatic relations. It began with a simple question, the same question that had been reverberating through my mind since I watched the battle feed. How? Not how did they win, because I had seen that with my own eyes. The precision, the coordination, the terrifying competence. The question was deeper than tactics. How was a species that looked so ordinary capable of fighting like that? I went looking for answers. I started with biology. I requested the human company's medical files through Captain Rennick, who provided them without hesitation. I spent an afternoon reviewing them with my chief medical officer, a Thyralian physician named Dr. Kelrath who had treated wounded soldiers from 9 different coalition species and thought she had seen the full range of what biology could produce on a battlefield. She had not. The humans were, by every standard metric the coalition used to assess combat species, unremarkable. Their reflexes were good, but not exceptional. Several coalition species had faster neural response times. Their visual acuity was moderate. Their hearing was limited to a narrow frequency band. Their physical strength, while respectable, was nothing compared to the Kreth or the Moldari. Their skin was soft, easily punctured, prone to damage from environmental hazards that Thyralian scales would shrug off. They had no natural armor, no venom, no biological weapons of any kind. On paper, they were a mid-tier species. Competitive, certainly. Capable, yes, but not dominant. Not the kind of civilization that should have been able to walk into a swarm of 8,000 hostile bioforms and walk out with 0 fatalities. The difference is not in the body, Dr. Kelrath told me, scrolling through neural architecture scans that the humans had provided. It is here. She tapped a display showing a cross-section of the human brain. Commander, this is the most aggressively optimized pattern recognition system I have ever encountered in a biological organism. She walked me through it. The human brain did not simply process sensory data, it ran predictive models. Constantly, unconsciously, in parallel with every other cognitive function. A human walking through a room was simultaneously tracking every object, every movement, every potential threat, and generating probability maps for what each element in the environment might do next. They did not react to events. They anticipated events, prepared responses before the events occurred, and executed those responses with a speed that looked superhuman, but was actually the result of having already decided what to do before the situation arose. Every combat-capable species has some version of this, Kelrath said. Threat assessment, predictive modeling, anticipatory response. These are standard survival adaptations. But the human system operates at a scale and speed I have never documented. They are running more predictive threads, across more variables, with greater accuracy, than any species in the Coalition database. And they do it without conscious effort. It is autonomic, like breathing. That evening, I found a group of human soldiers in a storage bay, playing a game with paper cards. I stood at the entrance and watched. There were 6 of them, seated in a circle, trading small discs that apparently represented wagers. They talked and laughed, and occasionally fell silent in ways that carried weight, and they played their game with an intensity that seemed entirely out of proportion to its apparent stakes. I watched for 30 minutes. In that time, I saw each player track the sequence of cards that had been revealed, calculate the probability of remaining cards based on what had been played, read the facial expressions and body language of every other player for signs of deception, construct false signals to mislead opponents, and adjust their strategy in real time, based on a continuous flow of information that would have overwhelmed a tactical computer. They were doing it for fun. The cognitive machinery that made them lethal on a battlefield, the pattern recognition, the predictive modeling, the ability to read opponents and adapt faster than the opposition could respond, was the same machinery they used to play games and tell stories and navigate the ordinary complexities of their social lives. War was not something they switched on, it was something they redirected. The capacity for combat was built into the same neural architecture they used for everything else, and they could not turn it off any more than they could choose to stop breathing. I sat down with a human sergeant named Callum Holt and asked him the question that had been burning in me since the battle. How do you do it? He looked at me with eyes that reminded me of Rennick's, that same quality of patient assessment that I was learning to recognize as a species-wide trait rather than an individual characteristic. Do what, Commander? Fight like that. Sustain that level of performance for hours without degradation. Take wounds that would incapacitate any other species and continue operating. How? Holt considered the question. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and hands that had clearly seen hard use, scarred across the knuckles and calloused in patterns that spoke of years of physical work. He did not answer immediately, and I had learned enough about humans by then to know that the delay was not confusion, but genuine thought. They took questions seriously. We evolved on a world that was trying to kill us, he said finally. Not occasionally, not in specific environments. Everywhere, all the time. From the moment our species became recognizable as something distinct. Predators faster than us, prey stronger than us, weather that could shift from survivable to lethal in an hour, diseases that could wipe out a population in a season, competing groups of our own kind who wanted what we had and would kill to take it. He paused, turning a card between his fingers. We were never the biggest, or the fastest, or the strongest thing on our world. Not once in our entire evolutionary history. Everything we encountered was better than us at something. So we learned to be good enough at everything. Good enough to run, good enough to fight, good enough to outlast. And the ones who could not adapt fast enough died, and the ones who could passed that ability to their children, and that went on for 1,000,000 years. But other species evolved under pressure, I said. The Thyralians have a dangerous homeworld. The Kreth evolved alongside apex predators that dwarf anything in human ecological history. Why are you different? Holt smiled. It was not a happy expression. Because your world made you tough, Commander. Ours made us relentless. There is a difference. A tough species survives what the environment throws at it. A relentless species refuses to stop until the environment submits. We did not just survive our world. We dominated it. Every ecosystem, every climate, every predator that once hunted us. We did not adapt to fit our environment. We adapted our environment to fit us. And when our world ran out of challenges, we went looking for new ones. He gestured at the walls of the storage bay, at the colony beyond, at the Vraxian-haunted sky. This is what we do. This is what we have always done. We find the thing that is trying to kill us, and we figure out how to kill it first. Not because we enjoy it, because our ancestors did it for so long that it became what we are. The survival instinct of a species that was never the apex predator, but refused to accept that fact. I thought about that for a long time. The next morning, Captain Rennick invited me to a planning session in her command post. a section of collapsed warehouse, that the humans had converted into an operational headquarters, with the same quiet efficiency they brought to everything. Maps covered the walls. Data feeds scrolled across portable displays. A human analyst named Lieutenant Grace Perry briefed the room on Vraxian swarm behavior patterns she had identified by cross-referencing 6 months of engagement data with biological models of hive mind decision architecture. The briefing was extraordinary. Perry had mapped the Vraxian hive mind's decision tree, identified its response latencies, cataloged its adaptive patterns, and built a predictive model that could forecast swarm movements with 70% accuracy up to 4 hours in advance. No coalition intelligence unit had ever achieved anything close to this. Perry had done it in 3 days with a portable computer and a dataset that any coalition analyst could have accessed. The hive mind is an optimization engine, Perry explained. It processes environmental data and generates the most efficient response. That is its strength and its weakness. Efficiency requires prediction, and prediction requires consistency. The hive mind expects its opponents to behave consistently, because consistent behavior is efficient behavior. When an opponent breaks that expectation, the hive mind must reprocess, and reprocessing costs time. That is the basis of adaptive pressure doctrine, I said. Yes, but there is a deeper application. Perry pulled up a strategic overlay of the entire Drethval theater. The hive mind does not just coordinate local bioforms. It coordinates the entire regional swarm through a network of queen nodes. Each queen node manages a sector, and the nodes communicate with each other to maintain strategic coherence. Destroy a queen node, and you do not just disrupt one sector. You force the entire network to reallocate processing resources to compensate for the loss. Destroy enough nodes, and the network collapses. The swarm fragments into uncoordinated local groups that can be defeated in detail. I stared at the overlay. You are describing a strategy for defeating the entire Vraxian presence on Drethval. Not just this siege, the entire campaign. We are describing a strategy for defeating the Vraxian swarm, Rennick said from the back of the room. Not just here, everywhere. We have been developing this doctrine for 3 years. The queen node architecture is the swarm's critical vulnerability, and we have mapped it across 4 star systems. The room was very quiet. I looked at Rennick, at her weathered face and flat gray eyes, and I asked the question that rose from my chest like a blade. You have had this capability for 3 years. You knew how to dismantle the swarm. Why did you not act? Rennick held my gaze. Because the coalition did not ask. Worlds were burning, species were dying. You had the answer, and you waited. The last 3 times we offered military assistance to an alien civilization, without being asked, those civilizations accused us of imperialism. Rennick's voice was level, controlled, but I heard something beneath the control. An old wound. The Pelori called it human aggression, and used it to justify severing diplomatic ties. The Drathi accused us of engineering the crisis to create a pretext for intervention. The Moldari passed a resolution in their planetary assembly declaring human military aid a form of cultural colonization. She paused. We learned that being strong enough to help is not the same as being trusted enough to help. So we developed our capabilities. We refined our doctrine. We watched the swarm expand across your territory, and we waited for someone to ask. I felt something heavy and cold settle in my stomach. I thought about my own skepticism before the humans arrived. I thought about the briefings I had attended where senior officers dismissed human combat capabilities as exaggerated. I thought about the intelligence reports I had read that characterized human military culture as aggressive, unpredictable, and potentially threatening to coalition sovereignty. I thought about the political calculations that had kept the coalition from requesting human assistance while world after world fell to the swarm. We did this. My species, and every species in the coalition, we did this to ourselves. We let our pride and our fear keep us from asking for help, and the price was measured in billions of lives. I am asking now, I said. Rennick looked at me for a long moment, then she nodded once, a small, precise movement, and turned to Perry. Begin strategic planning for Queen Node interdiction, full operational scope. That night, the sensors detected a massive Vraxian force massing on the eastern plains. Larger than the 6th wave, larger than anything the garrison had faced. The hive mind was committing its regional strategic reserve, every bioform it had held in depth, every siege organism, every aerial element. The swarm had made a decision. The humans were not a tactical inconvenience to be absorbed. They were a strategic threat to be eliminated. I stood in my command bunker and studied the sensor data and felt the old familiar mathematics of attrition warfare grinding through my mind. The numbers were worse than before. Much worse. If the swarm committed everything the sensors were showing, our garrison would face a force ratio that no defensive position in coalition military history had ever survived. Rennick appeared at my elbow. She studied the same data I was studying, the same impossible numbers, the same death sentence written in red contacts across the tactical display. She studied it for 30 seconds. Then she smiled. I had seen many things in my career. I had seen soldiers charge positions they knew they would not survive. I had seen medics walk into crossfires to reach wounded comrades. I had seen acts of courage and sacrifice and defiance that would fill volumes. But I had never seen someone smile at the approach of an army that outnumbered them 100 to 1, and the sight of it sent a chill through my body that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Good," Rennick said. "Now they are taking us seriously." She turned and walked out of the bunker, and I watched her go, and I understood, with the clarity that only comes when death is close enough to touch, that the legends had never been about what humans could do. They were about what humans wanted to do. About the part of them that looked at an impossible fight and felt not fear, but something closer to anticipation, something that had no equivalent in the Thyralian emotional vocabulary, and perhaps no equivalent in any species' vocabulary, because it was unique to a civilization that had clawed its way to dominance on a world that should have killed them and carried the scars of that climb written into every cell of their being. They did not fight because they had to. They fought because 10,000 generations of ancestors had fought things bigger and meaner, and more numerous than themselves, and won. And the echo of those victories was louder than any rational assessment of the odds. The Vraxians were bringing everything they had. The humans considered this good news. I went to prepare my garrison for what might be the last battle any of us would ever fight, and for the first time in 2 years, I was not preparing for defeat. The final battle began before dawn, in the gray half-light that comes before sunrise on Dreth Val, when the world looks like it has not yet decided whether to exist. They came out of the eastern darkness in a wave that had no end. Vraxian bioforms covered the plain from the mountain foothills to the river delta, a living carpet of chitin and fury that moved with the coordinated purpose of a single vast organism. Siege creatures lumbered behind the front ranks, their armored shells catching the first weak light. Spore carriers drifted overhead in clouds so thick they dimmed the sky, and somewhere behind it all, buried deep in the mass of the swarm, a queen node pulsed with the cold intelligence that directed every claw and spine and acid spitter on the field. I stood in my forward command post, 300 meters behind the main defensive line, and watched the horizon disappear behind the advancing horde. My tactical display had stopped trying to generate a count. The number was meaningless. What mattered was the density, the sheer mass of hostile biology rolling toward us, and by that measure, we were facing something that should have been impossible to survive. Captain Rennick had reorganized our entire defensive structure during the night. For the first time, human and coalition forces were integrated into a single tactical framework, and the design was elegant in a way that spoke to a deep understanding of what each force could and could not do. My Thyralian soldiers held the fixed defensive positions, the walls and bunkers and gun emplacements that anchored the perimeter. Their job was simple: absorb the initial charge, channel the swarm into killing corridors, and hold their ground. This was what my soldiers excelled at: endurance, stubbornness, the Thyralian refusal to give ground that had kept us alive through months of siege. The human squads operated between the fixed positions, mobile and fluid, ready to counterattack into any breach, exploit any weakness in the swarm's assault, and pull back before the next wave hit. They were the fist behind the shield, the striking force that turned a passive defense into something far more dangerous. All units, this is Commander Sonane. Weapons free on my mark. I watched the swarm approach the outer engagement range, The ground trembled beneath my feet. The sound of 40,000 bioforms advancing was not a roar or a scream, but a low, continuous vibration that I felt in my bones. Mark. The perimeter opened fire. Plasma bolts carved burning lines through the pre-dawn air. Projectile weapons hammered in staccato rhythms. Automated defense turrets swiveled and engaged with mechanical precision. The leading edge of the Vraxian wave dissolved into a wall of fire and shattered chitin that stretched across the entire front. And the swarm kept coming. They climbed over their own dead. They pushed through the fire, absorbing casualties that would have shattered any conventional army, and they hit our perimeter like a wave hitting a cliff. The impact was physical. I felt it through the floor of my command post, a deep shudder that ran through the permacrete foundation, as thousands of bioforms slammed into our barriers simultaneously. My soldiers held. They fired into the massive bodies pressing against the walls, and for those first terrible minutes, the math worked. The barriers held. The killing corridors funneled the bioforms into concentrated fire lanes. The fixed positions performed exactly as they were designed to perform, grinding the assault into a wall of casualties that the swarm could not easily bypass. But the swarm did not need to bypass them. It needed to outlast them. And in the raw calculus of attrition, the swarm had more bodies than we had ammunition. The first breach came on the southern wall, where a siege organism rammed through a weakened section and collapsed a 20-meter stretch of barrier. Vraxian bioforms surged through the gap before my reserve squads could respond. A human fire team was there in seconds, 4 soldiers, moving with that fluid, silent coordination that still made my scales prickle, positioned themselves at the edges of the breach and began firing into the swarm pouring through. They did not try to plug the gap. They created overlapping kill zones on either side of it, turning the breach itself into a killing corridor. Bioforms that made it through the wall ran straight into crossfire so dense and accurate that nothing survived more than 3 steps past the barrier line. My reserve squads arrived, filled the gaps between the human positions, and together, the combined force sealed the breach in 4 minutes. A breach that would have cost me an entire platoon and 20 minutes of desperate fighting was handled in 4 minutes with 0 casualties on our side. This was the integration that Rennick had designed, Thorelian endurance and human lethality, complementing each other, covering each other's weaknesses, creating something stronger than either force could have been alone. The pattern repeated across the perimeter. The swarm hit. The walls absorbed. When breaches opened, human strike teams appeared, stabilized the situation, and pulled back to let my soldiers reseal the line. It was a rhythm, a pulse of defense and counterattack that turned our perimeter into something the swarm could not break. Absorb, strike, reset. Absorb, strike, reset. But the swarm had numbers, endless, relentless, soul-crushing numbers, and as the morning wore on, the rhythm began to strain. The breaches came faster. My ammunition reserves dropped. My soldiers, fighting continuously for hours, began to slow. Fatigue set in, the grinding exhaustion that no amount of training or willpower could entirely defeat. Response times lengthened. Kill rates dropped. The margins thinned. By mid-morning, I could see the math turning against us again. We were holding, but we were eroding. The swarm was spending bioforms by the thousand, but it had thousands more to spend. At the current rate of attrition, we would be overwhelmed by late afternoon. Then Rennick activated the second phase of her plan. Commander San, I am deploying the interdiction element. 30 personnel, carrying biological disruptors and demolition charges, will push through the swarm line and move to the Queen node. We have identified its position 3 kilometers behind the Vraxian front. When the node is destroyed, the local hive mind network will collapse, and the swarm will lose coordinated control. I stared at her. Through the swarm line, 3 kilometers through a continuous mass of hostile bioforms. Correct. That is a suicide mission, Captain. Rennick held my gaze, and I saw in her eyes something that was not recklessness, and not fatalism, and not the cold acceptance of necessary sacrifice. It was certainty, the absolute, unshakable confidence of a person who has measured the odds and found them acceptable. It is a mission, Commander. My people volunteered. The interdiction team assembled at the eastern perimeter, 30 humans, loaded with equipment, checking weapons with the methodical calm of people preparing for a walk rather than a charge into the throat of a living nightmare. I watched them through the tactical feed, and I saw something I did not expect. They were not grim. They were not solemn. They moved with a focused energy that looked almost eager, as if the prospect of fighting through 3 kilometers of hostile territory against overwhelming odds was not a death sentence, but a challenge. A human concept I had been struggling to understand suddenly crystallized in my mind. They did not fear the impossible. They were attracted to it. The harder the task, the more impossible the odds, the more something in their evolutionary wiring lit up and pushed them forward. They were not brave in the way my soldiers were brave, overcoming fear through discipline and duty. They were brave in a way that bypassed fear entirely, driven by an engine that ran on challenge and struggle and the savage joy of testing themselves against the worst the universe could offer. The interdiction team moved out. I watched them through every sensor I could bring to bear, and what I witnessed over the next 2 hours was the most extraordinary display of combat capability I have ever seen or expect to see. They hit the swarm line at a full run, 30 humans firing in every direction, cutting a corridor through the mass of bioforms with a ferocity that left me breathless. They moved in a tight wedge formation, the point soldier clearing the path with controlled bursts while flankers protected the sides, and the rear guard kept the corridor from closing behind them. The Vraxian bioforms swarmed toward them from every direction. The humans killed them, not with the surgical precision of their earlier defensive fighting, but with a raw, aggressive violence that was somehow even more impressive, because it was controlled. Every movement served a purpose. Every shot cleared a path. Every decision moved the team forward, deeper into the swarm, closer to the Queen Node. They lost soldiers. For the first time since the humans had arrived on Dreth Val, I saw human casualties in the field. A corporal went down when a siege organism's tail strike caught her across the legs, and 2 of her teammates dragged her forward, while a third provided covering fire. A private took an acid spitter hit to the chest armor and kept running for 30 meters before his suit integrity failed, and a medic pulled him behind a dead siege organism for emergency treatment. They did not stop. They did not slow. They absorbed their casualties and pushed forward with a relentlessness that was not mechanical or mindless, but fierce, personal, driven by something I could only describe as a collective refusal to let the universe tell them no. At the 90-minute mark, the interdiction team reached the Queen Node's defensive perimeter. The Queen Node itself was enormous, a pulsing biological structure the size of a small building, embedded in the ground and surrounded by a ring of specialized defender bioforms that existed solely to protect the node from attack. These were not ordinary warrior-class Vraxians. They were larger, faster, and heavily armored, biological weapons platforms designed by the hive mind for a single purpose. The fight at the perimeter was savage. Rennick's people fought at close quarters, inside the reach of the defenders' ranged weapons, using every tool they had: rifles, grenades, blades. I saw a human sergeant grapple with a defender bioform twice his size, lock his arm around its neck joint, and hold it while his partner drove a knife into its neural cluster. I saw a fire team create a human chain across a gap in the defensive ring, each soldier covering the one in front of her, firing and moving and firing again, with a coordination that looked choreographed. 14 humans died at that perimeter. 14 soldiers who had walked into the mouth of the swarm knowing what waited for them, and went anyway, because the mission mattered more than their survival, and the people beside them mattered more than their fear. The surviving 16 soldiers reached the Queen Node's neural core. They placed their charges. They armed the detonators. The Queen Node died in a column of white fire that punched through the morning sky like a lance. Across the battlefield, the world changed. Every Vraxian bioform on Dreth Val felt the Queen Node die. I watched it happen through the tactical display, saw the coordinated assault dissolve in real time as the hive mind's local network shattered. Bioforms that had been pressing forward with lethal purpose stumbled, staggered, and began moving erratically. Some continued attacking, driven by residual neural programming, but their movements were uncoordinated and random. Some turned and fled, an instinct that had been suppressed by the hive mind reasserting itself in the absence of central control. Some simply stopped, standing motionless in the middle of the battlefield, like machines that had lost power. the organized assault disintegrated in minutes. My soldiers, stunned and exhausted, and running on nothing but adrenaline and the memory of what they had just witnessed, began the long work of clearing the disoriented swarm. Without coordination, the Vraxian bioforms were dangerous, but not lethal. Individual threats, not a unified army. My garrison, supported by human strike teams, swept through the remaining swarm with a methodical efficiency that bore no resemblance to the desperate defense of the previous hours. By afternoon, the battlefield was silent. I walked through it at sunset, picking my way across a landscape that defied description. The plain east of Colony proper was carpeted in Vraxian dead, a field of broken chitin and cooling biofluid that stretched to the horizon. The scale of destruction was difficult to process. Tens of thousands of bioforms, the full strength of a regional swarm, reduced to organic debris by a garrison that should have been destroyed. Among the Vraxian dead, I found the human dead. Their comrades had already recovered the bodies and brought them inside the perimeter. They were laid out in a cleared section of the vehicle yard where the dropship had first landed. 14 soldiers arranged in a neat row with their weapons placed across their chests. Their eyes had been closed, their armor had been cleaned. Someone had folded their hands. I stood at the end of that row and looked at 14 faces that would never move again, and I felt a weight settle onto me that I knew I would carry for the rest of my life. These soldiers had died for a world that was not theirs, fighting an enemy that had never threatened their own civilization, because someone had finally asked them for help, and they had said yes without hesitation. Captain Rennick stood at the head of the row. She was not crying, she was not speaking. She stood with her hands behind her back and her gray eyes fixed on her dead, with an expression that was beyond grief, beyond anger, beyond any emotional state I had a name for. It was the face of a commander who had sent people to their deaths and accepted that weight without breaking, and I recognized it because I had worn it myself too many times. I approached her. I stood beside her. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then I said the only thing I could think of. I am sorry we did not ask sooner. Rennick turned to look at me. Something shifted behind her eyes, a fracture in the controlled surface that hinted at the depth of what lay beneath. Not weakness, not collapse, just the sheer weight of being strong enough to help and spending years waiting for permission while the galaxy burned. "So am I, Commander," she said quietly. "So am I." She turned back to her dead. I left her there and walked to my command bunker, where I sat down at my terminal and began writing the after-action report that would change the course of the war, and, if I wrote it well enough, the course of galactic civilization. I wrote it plainly. No embellishment, no rhetoric, no appeals to emotion. I described what the humans had done on Dreth Val in the same language I would use to describe any military engagement, because the facts needed no amplification. I described their tactical capabilities, their adaptive doctrine, their psychological resilience, their willingness to take casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. I described the Queen Node interdiction and its effect on the swarm. I described the integration of human and Thyralian forces and the multiplicative effect of combining our respective strengths. And at the end of the report, I wrote a recommendation. Not a suggestion, not a proposal for further study. A recommendation, issued with the full authority of my rank and the full weight of my experience, that the Outer Rim Coalition immediately and unconditionally integrate human military forces into the coalition command structure, not as auxiliaries, not as mercenaries, not as a contingency to be activated when all other options had failed, as equals, and, in matters of ground combat, as leaders. I knew the recommendation would be controversial. I knew that the same political forces that had kept humans at arm's length for decades would resist it. I knew that species pride and institutional inertia, and the quiet, unspoken fear of human capability that ran through every level of coalition governance, would push back against integration. But I had stood on a battlefield and watched legends walk out of the stories and into the real world, and I had seen what happened when a species that was built for war fought alongside species that merely practiced it. The difference was not marginal, it was categorical, and the coalition could not afford to let pride or politics or fear prevent it from accessing the one capability that had proven it could turn the tide of a war we were losing. I finished the report late that night. The colony was quiet. The Vraxian dead still covered the plains, already beginning to decompose in the warm air, releasing a thick, organic smell that would take weeks to fade. My garrison's surviving soldiers were resting, some for the first time in days, sleeping the deep and dreamless sleep of people who had been given something they thought they had lost forever. A future. Before I transmitted the report, I walked the perimeter one last time. The emergency lights cast their white glow over walls scarred by acid and impact and fire. I passed Thyralian soldiers standing watch, with the quiet intensity of people who had learned, in the space of a single day, that the galaxy was not what they thought it was. I found Sergeant Holt near the eastern gun line, sitting with 3 other human soldiers, sharing a meal from metal containers. They ate the way they did everything, with a focused efficiency that left no movement wasted. They talked quietly, and when I passed, Holt looked up and nodded. Just a nod. Soldier to soldier. No deference, no formality, just the simple acknowledgement of shared experience that transcends species and rank and biology. I nodded back. At the vehicle yard, the human dead still lay in their row. 2 soldiers stood guard at each end, motionless, their rifles held in a position that I learned was called present arms, a human ritual of honor that dated back to a time before their species had discovered fire. They would stand there until dawn, Rennick had told me. Every fallen soldier was guarded through the night by their comrades. No one slept while the dead lay unwatched. I stood at the edge of the yard and looked at those silent guardians and their silent charges, and I thought about legends. The galaxy had made a mistake with humans, not by fearing them, because fear was a reasonable response to a species that had clawed its way to dominance on a death world, and then applied the same relentless adaptability to interstellar warfare. The mistake was letting that fear become an excuse for distance, for distrust, for the comfortable, cowardly fiction that human military capability was exaggerated, that the stories were just stories, that no species could really be that different from the rest of us. The stories were not exaggerated, they were sanitized. The reality of human combat capability was not something that translated well into barracks legends and officer briefings. It had to be witnessed. It had to be felt, in the bone-deep vibration of certainty that came from watching 140 soldiers hold a line against 8,000 enemies, from seeing 30 volunteers walk into the heart of a living nightmare and tear it apart with weapons and willpower, and the stubborn refusal to accept that any battle was unwinnable. Humans did not fight because they were angry, or because they were afraid, or because they had no choice. They fought because something in their blood remembered a million years of struggle against a world that was stronger than them, and that memory whispered to every human soldier on every battlefield that the odds did not matter, that the numbers did not matter, that the only thing that mattered was whether you were still standing when the fight was over. I returned to my bunker. I sat at my terminal. I read through my report one final time, checking every word, every statistic, every recommendation. Then I added one final paragraph, the one that I knew would be quoted in every military academy and political chamber across the coalition for decades to come. The paragraph said this: "We, the species of the Outer Rim Coalition, have spent a century studying humans and have learned nothing. We cataloged their biology and missed their cognition. We measured their strength and ignored their will. We heard their legends and chose to call them myths, because the truth was too large to hold comfortably in our understanding of the universe. The truth is simple. Humans evolved on a world that tried to kill them every day, and they did not merely survive it. They conquered it. They loved the conquest. Not out of cruelty or bloodlust, but out of something older and deeper, a refusal written into their genes to accept that any fight is unwinnable, any enemy unbeatable, any darkness permanent. They are not gods. They are not monsters. They are what happens when a species spends its entire existence being told it cannot win and decides, with every generation, with every breath, with every heartbeat, that it will win anyway. We were fools to call that mythology. We were greater fools to let our foolishness cost us the alliance that could have ended this war before it consumed 100 worlds." I transmitted the report. Then I walked to the eastern wall, where the first light of a new day was just beginning to touch the horizon, and I looked out across the battlefield, where the dead lay thick, and the living had earned their right to see tomorrow. In the distance, I could see the human soldiers carrying their fallen comrades toward the dropship with slow, careful steps, supporting the weight between them, walking together in a silence that was not empty but full of respect and grief, and the fierce, unbreakable love of people who would die for each other, without hesitation, and mourn each other without shame. I watched them until the light grew strong, and the last of the fallen was aboard, and I thought about the report I had sent, about the words I had written, about the legends that were real, and the future that was possible, if the galaxy could find the courage to accept what I had seen on this battered, blood-stained colony world. The legends were real, all of them, and we were fools to ever pretend otherwise.